What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson, checking in with another dumpster fire episode. Hope everybody is well. And there's a bunch of stuff I want to cover, and I can tell already that there's not going to be enough time to get to everything on the agenda. And like the last stream, there were two big reaction videos, topics I wanted to cover. Didn't even have time to start them. Three, actually. Uh, One of those I've got to get to today. So my priority today is to do a kind of reaction video segment about the Francis Fukuyama interview with Ian Bremmer. I'm obviously a critic of Fukuyama in a lot of ways. He's not my guy, but I do have some personal intersections with him that I'll talk about a little bit later. And I think the important thing is that like he's a very smart champion of like the lib perspective on things. So when he assesses the world, um, there's there's tons of room that you get to see on display. Like, okay, how are the libs processing the world in this moment, and what does that mean? You know, and then obviously I'll inject my critiques or whatever. I have not watched this interview, so like I'm going to be watching it sort of with y'all in real time and processing it. So we'll see how that goes. But that was what like I really wanted to do. And so I am going to do it. The other stuff I wanted to get to today, yeah, whatever we don't end up hitting, I'll hit on the next stream. There's possibly going to be one tomorrow. So right before jumping onto the stream today, like literally 20 minutes ago, I saw that Tony Blinken had given a speech at the Atlantic Council. It was live today, so this is like very fresh. And I've debated whether I can like sit through and do a reaction video on the Tony Blinken video itself. I don't know if I can stomach it right now because this guy fucking makes me sick. Like his detachment from reality above all else kind of like drives me insane. But and like the gaslighting that he's doing to us, but possibly also to himself, I like it's too much. But I did want to show um why this banal think tank speech full of lies, why it's going viral right now, because it is absolutely going viral, right? If you remember from maybe last week, I did a live stream where one of the segments I talked about dark money in think tanks and the Atlantic Council there, because there was a report that the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft did, and they were showing that there was like a lack of transparency in a certain number of think tanks about where their funding comes from. But then in addition to that, there were, and those were dark money think tanks, because it's like, who's funding them? Dark forces, who knows, presumably dark forces. But then there were other think tanks that were like fairly transparent in where they were getting their money, but they were getting their money from really fucking bad sources. So foreign governments, including autocratic, despotic governments, and defense industrialists, and defense contractors, and then some from the U.S. Government, which is its own kind of compromise, but less corrupt. So, anyways, the Atlantic Council, I had identified a long time ago that they're kind of one of the bad guy institutions for a number of reasons, right? And I laid that out in my newsletter, undiplomatic.com, un-diplomatic.com. But the Quincy Institute report on dark money think tanks sort of converged with that my analysis, and both sort of presented the Atlantic Council as like the chief liberal hawk think tank in the worst way, in the way that's hypocritical about supporting democracies and stuff even. So that was that's the Atlantic Council, and that's important to know going into this speech, because Blinken has been on a road show, and the Biden administration itself has been on a road show, just gaslighting again themselves and the public, taking a victory lap on specifically foreign policy. You know, they're going around giving public speeches trying to like frame what has happened the past 4 years as a series of successes, as opposed to a series of like catastrophic failures. This is the worst foreign policy. Uh, I was gonna say like in my lifetime, you know, but the Iraq War was pretty fucking bad, and the War on Terror is pretty fucking bad. But we're still doing the War on Terror. So what does that tell you? You know, Biden has presided over starting over new wars and continuing the old ones, and there were no complicities in genocides with past presidents in my lifetime, except for when we were buddy buddy with Myanmar while they were doing a genocide in 2016. But we'll put that aside for now. But anyway, the Biden administration has not had a good foreign policy. Nobody thinks it's a good foreign policy. Everybody thinks that it's shit the bed in many, many, many areas, like overall. But some people who are generous to the Biden administration or who are like Washington liberals or who depended on the Biden administration's access for their relevance, those people would selectively say that the Biden administration has done well here. They've done well there on their pet issues where they have blind spots, where they're fucking Uber hawks, you know, and I don't know. That's not great. Or where they rely on the defense industry. So all of that is a prelude to say that like Blinken is doing this road show saying, look at how great we've been the past 4 years on foreign policy. And it's part of a larger Biden administration effort to try and recapture the narrative in contradistinction to reality that they've been good on foreign policy, right? So that's where this speech is coming from. And then here is the actual like interruption. So there was a protester who was in the room for Biden's speech, actively disrupted the protest. We're calling him Bloody Blinken, Secretary of Genocide, which is like precisely correct. And this is absolutely how he's going to be remembered, in part, not just because people in the street say so, but because also the Trump administration and MAGA and the Republicans, they have no interest in salvaging Blinken's reputation. They have no interest in salvaging the Biden administration's legacy. And so if the popular energy and just basic brute reality says that Biden has shit the bed and is complicit in genocide and war crimes and is a fucking warmonger, and Blinken is his warmonger in chief, if that's the sort of larger perspective that people have, not just in the streets, but in the op-ed pages, our fucking eyes, we can see it on social media, you know, the Republicans are probably going to like ride that wave, not try to staunch it. And that means that truly the liberal twilight has come on foreign policy. Blinken is the last dinosaur. You know, he's dying. He's dying and he doesn't even know it. Maybe he does. I don't know. But anyway, let's check out the disruption because like I have thoughts about this. So
Bloody Blinken, Secretary of Genocide, you have the blood of hundreds of thousands of innocent people on your hands. We have spent a year trying to appeal to your humanity in front of your house. We've written you letters. We've held car rallies. The blood of innocent civilians, of children, is on your hands. We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hold you accountable. We will hold you accountable. Blinken.
I've been in that room many times. Look at these motherfuckers though, you know? Like They they're just sitting there silent, right? Bloody Blinken, you will be held accountable, right? This is like what she's saying is like reasonable and correct. And I think the only question is, do you is this the tactic? You know, like, do you disrupt these public events? Um, Given the purpose of these public events, I'm actually very supportive of this. You know, this is the kind of civil disobedience and disruption that is valuable, necessary, good, beneficial, or at least not harmful. Because Biden or not Biden, well, what's the difference? Biden, Blinken, whatever. Like literally the only thing he's doing at the Atlantic Council today in doing this speech, it's just to launder his reputation and the reputation of his genocidal foreign policy. It's literally just to celebrate, which is to say, to fucking brainwash all of us, to say that like what we see and what we know and what makes sense don't make sense. Actually, we've been fucking great, and it's a weird mystery why and how Trump won. Who knows? Who knows? Probably just inflation. Probably nothing to do with our foreign policy, which also heightened inflation, by the way. But holy fuck, you know. These guys, the thing that really bothers me, let me see where's that fucking, if you see in the video, look at the people in the room while this woman who's speaking morally on behalf of justice, on behalf of accountability, she's literally being physically ushered out and screaming, "Bloody Blinken, Secretary of Genocide, you will be held accountable." And all these stuffed suits are just sitting there. Some of them, you can tell, are anguished in their silence. They're ashamed. You can tell, you know it. And you know some of them are there to report on Blinken critically. So they need to be there because they need to be in the room, but actually they're sympathetic. They probably stand with the protester. Um, but you can see a lot of these guys, they're just fucking diddling around on their phones, or like they can't wait to go to brunch after this and or ask they're hoping they can get a question to Blinken. They're eating up his rhetorical subterfuge. They're going to pretend like this protest shit didn't happen. Blinken's not going to mention the genocide in Gaza in this speech, and the people in the audience are probably fine with that. You know, the Atlantic Council has been one of the worst or the worst think tanks on Gaza, in the sense that they do not acknowledge that it's happening, and at the same time they've been riding so hard for Ukraine. And so to completely erase the Palestinian existence, Palestinian self-determination, at the same time that you want, there's no amount of money or blood or treasure that you will not spill on behalf of Ukraine. That, what is that? That to me is a fucking white supremacist think tank, if that's what's going on. You know, the hypocrisy is impossible. It's unbelievable. Or it's a Zionist think tank, right? They don't do a lot of stuff on behalf of Israel, from what I know, as far as I know, but the contrast is impossible. The contradiction is impossible. Evangelist says, "Are you watching the SecDef hearings?" Oh man, I do not. I'm going to catch it in replay or whatever. I'm not watching it live, that's for sure. So, um, the SecDef hearings will be fun because Pete Hegseth is a monster, and and also not a super smart guy. You know, like he went to a good school, because a lot of these monsters went to good schools. You know, Trump went to a good school, so that don't mean shit. But like I've seen a couple of his appearances on Fox News. I actually knew a guy who served with Hegseth. Not impressed. You know, he has always, it's not like he got radicalized to the right because of the Forever Wars. Like, he took part in the Forever Wars, but he's always been a fucking right wing warmonger guy who tries to drape it in patriotism and, you know, Christian white nationalist crosses on his chest and shit. That's like what he's always been on. Um, I'm sure he's fucking denying everything. The thing is, like, it's not clear to me that the Democrats actually have the wherewithal to stop his nomination. It's only if Republicans want to stop his nomination that it will stop. Like, a senator can filibuster, but the filibuster is kind of like a weak weapon. And Democrats don't like to do it because if you know about the filibuster as like a Senate blocking tactic, you know, like a single senator can give a speech on the floor unlimited, unlimited time. And that's a way of preventing a vote on something. And so by filibustering, you have to physically put yourself on the floor in front of the mic and you have to just keep talking. You can be reading out of a cookbook, you can do whatever. There was a senator who did that once actually. Like it doesn't matter what you're saying, and you have unlimited time because you're a senator. But eventually you have to like eat and drink and go to the bathroom. And when you stop filibustering, when you stop speaking on the floor, that's when they can force a vote. Right. And so a single senator has to actually be willing to filibuster in tandem with other senators who are also willing to filibuster. Um, hey, Fabuli's in the chat. And so, like, if Hegseth is just gaslighting everyone and lying during the hearings, what's Democrat going to do? You know, like, he can only really be held to account by Republicans, but are Republicans going to hold Hegseth to account? That seems pretty unlikely, you know? Yes, like Brett Kavanaugh, right? It's like the Brett Kavanaugh hearings for the Supreme Court. It was like, this guy is not the guy. He's not qualified to be on the Supreme Court. This is a joke. He might be an actual criminal. And the it didn't matter. You know, we had this searing testimony from somebody who was accusing him of sexual assault, a credible person, and it didn't matter. Didn't matter. If you got the votes, you got the votes, you know? So, yeah, that's shitty. Anyways, I'm really glad I left Washington, D.C. Really, really glad. Maybe the best decision of my life. Because if I was still in that like national security think tank ecosystem, I would probably be press ganged into attending the Blinken speech at the Atlantic Council. And I'd probably be having to wear a suit. And I'd probably have to fucking sit there quietly while a human voice is speaking on behalf of justice, being muzzled by security while everyone else pretends like it's not fucking happening. You know, that's the Orwellian shit. It's unbelievable. So that's that. Um, I guess sort of related to that, I had a newsletter piece the other day called, what is it called? Is national security hashtag resistance over. And the idea here is, you know, I was doing some reflections about the sort of resistance libs in Trump 1.0 and how, like, in 2016, I remember I was part of the like foreign policy cadre, right, for the Democratic Party. And we were so jarred and stunned by everyone in the national security state was like just overwhelmed by Trump's win. Truly a black swan for them, for us, right? And our immediate reaction once people got over their tears was to specifically just like become the resistance, to say like, we will stop Trump, you know? And yeah, and so like the so I don't want to say, like, I'm looking at all this critically now, but I was part of that moment, and it's important. And I talk about this in the piece, right? In that moment, the media, mainstream media, and the capitalist class itself, had not reconciled itself to a Trump victory. And so, in that context, the power brokers of society, the ruling class, had not really like accommodated themselves to Trump. And so the idea of liberal resistance, even within the national security state, that was popular. It was a vibe, and there were people taking it very seriously. This these the flyers on the, I don't know if you can how well you can see it, but like the cover picture here on the newsletter post, these flyers that say "Not Our Choice" and they have Trump's face on it. These were getting distributed around Washington D.C. by like foreign policy people, basically trying to like foment resistance. They called themselves the Falada Project, and if you go to the piece you can read more about the Falada Project, but it's literally analogizing itself to like Jewish resistance in Nazi Germany. Like they literally were thinking of the Trump administration, as Nazi Germany, and they were doing the resistance. And I've talked about this before with the fascism stuff. There's a way in which I'm totally down with that even now, but the halfwayness of it, the inability to see how fashy you're being, like with Blinken at the fucking speech, erasing the voice of Gaza, and then instead trying to sell us this propaganda foreign policy, that's pretty fucking fascist if you ask me. And so, like, um, I was willing to go all the way with applying the label. The resistance libs were only willing to treat Trump as the unique thing and put the label on him only, and then resist him. And that resistance lib energy ended up converting into a kind of alliance during the Trump years. I don't know if people remember this, between the social movements in the streets, social justice movements, and DSA to some extent, and Working Families Party to some extent, and the Justice Democrats, and the Sunrise Movement, and all of that, with progressive foreign policy as an intellectual movement, which really blossomed in the Trump years, of which I was a part. This is sort of how I became like known to a lot of people. And like that, if there hadn't been that sort of like national security resistance lib reaction to Trump, that kind of larger coalition wouldn't have been conceivable, I don't think. And so there's one key part in the piece that I just want to read out here, because it's kind of everything. I say, quote, "The thing that has dampened fighting enthusiasm among dutiful opponents of fascism," so I wrote this like 2 days ago, right, "is the power structure of the Democratic Party and the national security state, which are separate but converge. Too many of Trump's policies became Biden's policies. All of them, really. Biden himself called Trump a fascist, then welcomed him to the White House as soon as a plurality of Americans voted for him. And most gutting of all, the U.S. security state has played a vital role in unrepentantly perpetuating a genocide that an entire generation of Americans has been able to watch on social media in real time." The whole idea here is like the Naomi Klein tweet that I've mentioned several times. Gaza has blown a hole in our moral universe. Now, any evil thing can drive through, and we don't have the the fortitude to oppose it, to resist it. Right? We've destroyed our ability to resist Trump. And the resistance libs, I talk about this in the piece. It was not all good. A lot of it was conservative, and still primacist. And so that's not, obviously not ideal. Like, I'm not like a fan of the resistance lib, but as a social phenomenon, as a political phenomenon, it had a certain use in Trump 1.0, and I'm really skeptical that it's going to exist in Trump 2.0. And I think a lot of that owes to Gaza and the complicity of the foreign policy establishment and of the national security state in unbelievable amounts of violence, hierarchy, exclusion, hypocrisy, overt contradictions with the narratives about US foreign policy. And everybody who's not getting paid to do foreign policy knows this. It's just too obvious, you know? So I'm worried about what it looks like for a Trump presidency who is more practiced at being president than the first time, has more loyal cadre around him than the first time, and who has no real internal resistance compared to the first time. What does that end up looking like? What does that add up to? It's not good. It's not good, you know? Like at least the liberal resistance thing created speed bumps. And like since Democrats have no power now, and people in the streets and the masses have no power now electorally, we speed bumps within the system is all we got. That and the filibuster. So not feeling great, you know. Bevangela says, thought my piece was on the money. You're on the money. Thank you. Yeah. So national security resistance, you know, I actually periodize the beginning of the end of the Resistance Libs to Alexander Vindman appearing on Curb Your Enthusiasm. And I don't know if people watch it. It's my favorite show. Like, I love that show so much. I think it's hilarious. I even thought that the Alexander Vindman episode was funny, but I don't know, like that was kind of cringy also because Curb, which is a popular show, was holding Vindman up as this resistance lib hero, and that was like kind of jumping the shark at that point, you know, celebrating that too much maybe, and it all kind of died down from there. Wait, what does what look like from New Zealand chat? Like Curb Your Enthusiasm? I don't know. So national security resistance. All right, well, all right. How do I stop sharing this? All right. The thing, but one more thing before I get to the Fukuyama reaction video, which I'll be watching in real time, by the way. There's one more thing I wanted to get to. America before the inauguration. Oh, what does America before the inauguration look like from New Zealand? It looks like shit. it looks like civil war or fascism, not clear. TBD, you know. The thing, like, people are worried that there's going to be like a lot of violence, but it's not. It's a vibe. It's not like analytically we know there's going to be violence, you know, and it's not clear from what direction it will come. You know, it's clear enough that if Kamala had won, there was going to be militia violence. There was going to be like far right terrorism out the wazoo. But if your man is in power, you don't have a ton of incentives to go out and do terrorism and militia violence, you know? So like, hopefully, Trump being president releases some of the pressure valve of the far right counter-revolutionary violence stuff. But you still have the actual like people who are mentally ill within that space, like the Livelsberger, the guy who, you know, blew up the Tesla truck. You're still going to have stuff like that because there's tons of mental health issues, not just in America, but among vets and among right-wing vets, especially. So you're still going to have, even under Trump, plenty of right-wing violence. And I'm really hoping no left-wing violence. Yeah. Weirdly, there is a contingent in New Zealand and especially in Australia who is like absolutely gaga over the US, not as it actually exists, but as like an idealized version of America. Like they're stuck in the unipolar moment, and it's these same, and so they think in those terms, and they're ironically, not ironically, incidentally, they are maybe causally, they are the same group of people who, when I first moved here, would like fetishize the Victorian Empire. Like the being right wing in Australia and New Zealand, it usually means, because like they have their own historical context, it often means like, or it's coded, coded, coded in a way that is um like yearning for empire. So like the right wing ruling class in both countries back in the day, they actually didn't, during the decolonial moment, they didn't want independence from the mothership. They wanted to still be part of the British Empire, and that lives on. It's not cool. It's not like fashionable to admit that in public, but there's like low key ways to signal that. And so you signal favorability for like quote unquote traditional partners, for things like AUKUS, you know, you talk about like alliances and rules based order. This is all like coded language for like a preference for empire, in a different era that would have been a language of empire, you know, and those people tend to view America in an idealized way, in a romantic way. And so that's part of why they are like attracted to AUKUS and traditional partners and all of that. Yeah, Europe got Helmut Rochowski. Yeah, Europe got, they fucked themselves in a way, because like the way that they've responded to Ukraine with like flag waving nationalism, you know, and then ironically like attaching that to America and NATO as like their salvation. They've their imagination is like so stunted. Like their ability to think about security, even in their own best interest, is like so narrow. It's just about killing people in the name of deterring the big bad. And like Russia is not going to try to fucking conquer Europe. It couldn't if it wanted to, but that's in their imaginations. That's like the real thing. And in order to keep America on side, they're even willing to confront China, even though they have no ability to. It's fucking insane. It's fucking insane. Oh, you're from a former British colony, Buffangelist. Yeah, it's weird. It's weird. I didn't realize until coming here that like the way you signal, I mean, like, in white supremacy and empire is mixed together too. So to signal conservatism or imperialism or classical geopolitics or empire, all of that, like reactionary alliances, all of those things are kind of synonyms in a way. And then you only invoke the words that are fashionable in the moment. It's kind of crazy. Yeah. Yeah, Lithuania strut around the world behaving badly. Yeah, I was at the International Studies Association conference, and there was a scholar from Lithuania who was really critical of progressive foreign policy stuff. And she was, it turns out, um, like a solid scholar, but like she was got so much like brain rot from Russia's invasion of Ukraine that she could only think and talk about deterrence, and deterrence equals overwhelming force. And it was like the Russian understands nothing but it was just like a rehash of the fucking Cold War, that purely 100%. Um, kind of crazy. What did Lithuania do? What did they not do? Yes. So Lithuania brain rot. One, before I get to this Fukuyama shit, there was one thing I wanted to share. This is funny. It's all funny. Um, Biden just christened 2 new aircraft carriers. The USS George W. Bush and the USS Bill Clinton. You can't make this stuff up. Like, it's so I don't know how much people know about like, military hardware. Aircraft carriers are like the size of a fucking city. They're huge. They're big enough so that fighter jets can take off and land on them. They have a fucking runway. That's the idea, aircraft carrier, right? So it's a way historically, like in World War II-ish, it was a way of projecting power because you can put a ship out to sea with jets on it. And then because the jets are not taking off from land, they can travel much farther, much faster because they're launching from the ocean. And then they can come back and land on the deck of the carrier, right? And then, so these things are behemoths. They're like underneath, there's like literally like a civilization underneath keeping it going, manning it. And this, the aircraft carrier has been the ultimate symbol of American power and of American primacy. And there's this tradition of naming them after former presidents. This to name them after George Bush, though, and Bill Clinton is kind of ironic because, in my view, nobody did more to kind of destroy the US and to destroy America's hegemonic position than Bill Clinton, champion of neoliberalism, and George W. Bush, champion of the fucking war on terror, which has literally rotted our society and distorted our military and the lives of everybody who has to serve. And so, like, that the symbol of American power would carry their names, these guys who degraded American power even on its own terms, is a bit fresh. Like, it's almost too perfect, And the idea that Biden would think that these guys are worthy of naming a vessel after also says a lot about Biden's worldview, you know? So I'm not going to like rant on and on about this, but I did want to say this ties into something interesting because like aircraft carriers now are increasingly useless. They are giant sitting targets. Because they're so big and we live in a world of missiles and submarines, aircraft carriers are extremely large and extremely expensive. And we only have, I mean, that's why we have, 11 of them only. Like, and half of them are in maintenance at any given time, But like that symbol of American power is a kind of too perfect symbol of American power in the sense that like its use is mostly for like gunboat diplomacy. Like the thing that it's actually it's rarely used for combat operations. And they're against a modern adversary like China or Russia, it kind of has no use. It's too much of a sitting duck, and yet it costs untold amounts of fucking money, right? And what's crazy about this and the segue that I wanted to offer up was like I worked with a guy who was he was a right winger. He was a Teddy Roosevelt stan, and he was also like he was not a dummy, but his politics were horrific, and he was notable primarily because he spoke out publicly as he was retiring from the Navy. He was like a captain. Um, as he was retiring, he was publicly explaining that like the aircraft carrier, this ultimate weapon, is useless in the future of war. Like we're going to spend more and more money trying to protect the aircraft carrier and countermeasures to defend it. And it's like that could be used for other purposes. Just in the narrow world of military strategy, an aircraft carrier just don't make sense, right? It's mismatched to a world of proliferating missiles. It just is, and drones. So he was warning about this a long time ago, and it made him a very controversial figure. But he was not like, I've never liked his politics, but he was just like a normal Republican way back in the day. And then he became this like MAGA militarist guy. And he's not unique in this respect. Like, there's several people that I knew from the national security state world who back in the day, if you asked him what what are your politics or who's your favorite president, they would say with a fucking straight face, Teddy Roosevelt, who was an imperialist and a white supremacist, and who was unapologetic about it, who believed in savage wars, right, against quote unquote savages. Um, not a great example, right? And these guys today, they wouldn't. I mean, now that we're in Trump imperialism, who knows? But like today, these guys would not identify as imperialists, but they did identify as Teddy Roosevelt stands, and he was an imperialist. And so today, what's fashionable for them to talk about is themselves as like classical geopoliticians. They take a classical geopolitics perspective, right? Which is like a reference to Alfred Thayer Mahan or Halford Mackinder. And these guys came up with concepts for empires navigating among other empires at the expense of everybody else, at the expense of the darker races. You know what I mean? Um, and every single one of these Teddy Roosevelt stands that I know from the national security state, I don't keep in touch with most of them, but I see them on social media sometime. They are all MAGA heads. So there's like a section of the national security state that is like openly aligned with MAGA and like national conservatism. Those fucking guys, like, they we should have seen it coming. We should have seen it coming. You worship at the altar of Teddy Roosevelt, of course you're gonna fucking like Trump, you know? And so now, like, they're the ones who are going to strategy wash all of Trump's Greenland stuff, Panama Canal. They've been jerking off to the Panama Canal my whole lifetime, these guys, you know, because again, Teddy Roosevelt. So they're like, they're so fucking horny for Trump imperialism, and they're gonna do everything in their power to rationalize it, to make it sound sane, to package it as normal foreign policy considerations, but they want to land grab the shit out of everybody, you know? Manifest destiny mode. Yeah. So anyways, that's the aircraft carrier saga. The other thing, so now finally, Francis Fukuyama. Let me see if I can pull this up. So in 2019, so Francis Fukuyama, I believe everybody who has any passing awareness of like foreign policy stuff knows him. He's a scholar at Stanford, and he wrote, of course, the End of History book article, for which he became super, super, super famous. And I don't, other than catching the vibes of the moment, I don't understand why. It's not like it was a great book. But he got mad success off of that. Again, he's not dummy. He's not a dummy, but his politics are not mine. His worldview is not mine. In 2019, I did a job talk at Stanford, and I didn't get the job. But he came to my research presentation. Yeah, it was not good. And he asked one question. I don't remember what it was, but it was kind of like, it was not an impressive question. It was kind of like a banal question. But when he stepped into the room, the air shifted a little bit. Like when Frank came, because his friends call him Frank Fukuyama. When Frank came in the room, everybody kind of like took notice and adjusted a little bit, and it was like a very subtle thing, but it spoke to like the gravitas of this guy, and that's part of why, like, his notability is part of why I think it's worth parsing what he thinks. So I'm gonna share this video, stop it intermittently to like ad lib or whatever. This is not something that I have like pre-screened. So I don't really know what he's going to say, but I've read him deeply. I know his work. I know how he thinks. His last book I read and I hated it. It was about fucking identity politics shit, but from kind of like a right liberal perspective. And so like, yeah. So anyways, and still he's like kind of an interesting thinker. So we'll go through this. Maybe he says a bunch of stuff that I agree with. Who knows? So we'll find out. And then if you have thoughts along the way, chat. Feel free.
Frank Fukuyama, it's really good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you too, Ian.
I've been talking a lot about how we're reverting to the law of the jungle, that it feels more like what I call a G0 world. And I'm wondering, as someone who's been thinking about this for a lot longer than I have.
Should say, if you don't know Ian Bremmer, I'm not gonna do my critique of him right now, but when I was still in the Pentagon, he came out with a book and a concept that he called G0 world. All it was identifying multipolarity or non-polarity as the new structure of the world system, which is to say that like the unipolar moment is over. We don't have a single hegemon ordering things by their might anymore. And that was that was the gist of it. And so he refers to G0 world all the time. His show that he's got Francis Fukuyama on is called G0 world.
How do you think about where the world order is going right now, and why?
Well, I think that it's actually a much more confusing world order than we've seen in my lifetime, because it's not organized really ideologically, although ideology still plays a role. One of the most uncertain factors has been the United States, because the United States for many decades has been basically an exporter of stability. Not everyone believed that, but
are you fucking kidding me? So this is okay. This is the if you're going to point to like one thing that distinguishes a liberal thinker from me or a critic or a heterodox or a left or a socialist or a class conscious thinker, it's this issue of American power and its function in the world. The libs, the Fukuyamians, the Bremerians, they think, and they assume that American power has been a net good in the world, that it has been a stabilizing force in the world, and they are confused. You just heard Fukuyama say it. He's confused. They're confused about what's happening now because America is still super powerful, but the world is becoming more and more destabilized. And it's seemingly destabilized as a function of US power. And so they're perplexed. That's why they see black swans everywhere. They're like, this shit is inexplicable. You know what I mean? And so it's this worldview built around the presumption of American preeminence, American primacy, American exceptionalism implicitly. That leaves you really confused by the sort of polycrisis world, right? So he's showing a blind spot here already. We're 30 seconds into this fucking thing.
But there was a larger world order that had been established by the United States, and it was very.
Will Fukuyama mention the wildfires happening in the state where he lives and is sitting right now doing this? My bet is no. My bet is he will not fucking mention the fires, and that itself will be very telling. But let's find out.
powerful, particularly in that 20-year period between the fall of the Berlin Wall and, let's say, the financial crisis in 2008. But now the United States is in the process, it looks like, of checking out. And so it's going to be, I think, very turbulent.
Is the United States checking out, or is it deciding that it wants to create its own rules for its own benefit?
Well, it's complicated because the liberal world order that we seem to be moving away from was actually created by the U.S. in its own self-interest because, we were the biggest trading power and it benefited us to have open markets and free trade and so forth. And we've
So this is also one of the interesting things, right? Like Fukuyama is correct that the world order as it existed in our minds or in the minds of policymakers and imposed upon reality, it was designed deliberately to benefit the US disproportionately. The quote unquote liberal international order, thank God nobody uses that term anymore. It was designed in the American interest narrowly, but it was packaged and conceived as something that would be globally beneficial. It was sold to others as if it would be globally beneficial. And the irony or paradox or contradiction of our current moment, especially for people like Fukuyama, you can tell he's in his office, by the way, in Stanford. The building where his office is, I love that fucking building. John Steinbeck lived there when it was dorms because he went to Stanford for a couple of years back in the day. Anyways, my Steinbeck anecdote. What was I saying? Fuck. Oh, so for like people like Fukuyama, the liberal international order, quote unquote, was an order that was the American national interest. Like a bunch of smart, self-interested people in Washington had decided this is how it's going to be. This is what is in our best interest. They thought about it long and hard. They were doing it from a self-interested perspective. And then that's the conclusion they came to. And that's why they decided to pursue, eventually the GATT, the WTO, IMF, World Bank, Security Council, all this shit. And so the world that we inhabit, its structures and its ligatures and all this stuff, this was part of the design that they intended. And now that they're looking at the world and they're saying like, this should still pay off for us. The Fukuyamas still believe that this kind of liberal international order is something that you could have just done forever and ever, right? I mean, the end of history. It's in the name, But this is why they struggle to make sense of people like Trump. They struggle to make sense of the MAGA movement. They don't really have an account for it, and so you hear him repeatedly already refer to like it's complicated, it's complex, it's chaos, it's uncertain. They're like, it's like a shrug, like I don't know. They're not trying to have an account to explain our current moment. They're trying to be like, we had a really good account of our previous historical moment, the unipolar moment, and now that doesn't seem to fit with reality. And so all we can say is like, it's chaos. It's confusing. All right.
suddenly decided that we don't really like that. And actually, the model that
Stanford was
seems to be in the back of Trump's mind is, a much narrower one where all the great powers basically try to maximize their own, welfare, not according to any particular principle, and they don't invest in anything like a, general global public good.
So it's true that in a world of nation states, the nation states are not going to be looking after a global public good. Sure, they're going to be out for themselves first and foremost. This is the sort of traditional understanding of having the national interest as your guiding light, as your North Star, But what, again, like lacking any kind of account or interpretation or explanation for how we're getting here is really problematic, because the nationalism that we're seeing didn't just emerge in a vacuum. It emerged in response to the grievances caused by the unipolar moment, by the neoliberal economic order, by, if you want to really New York Times wash it, just globalization, right? And so, like, that world threw off tons of inequities, tons of labor repression, tons of precarity around the world, tons of structural violence, even within rich countries. And that engendered a backlash. Left parties and left organizations around the world, even in the US, had the right diagnosis about all this stuff. They were critiquing this stuff all along, and they had solutions, but the left parties were not bringing it in. And so the electoral parties, the center left parties, I should say, were not incorporating this whole leftist critique and leftist prescription. They ignored it. They did the Bill Clinton thing, the technocracy, right? And so they pushed more and more neoliberalism and globalization. And so that left the lane wide open for nationalist demagogues to demagogue against the previous economic order and say, like, actually, it's those globalist elites, right? And so the solution, and it's not that globalist elites weren't a problem, but the nationalism is not a solution. But in the absence of any kind of left power block or like left political consciousness or class consciousness, nationalism is the only alternative. You know, that's my account. Anyways. Yeah, let's see.
I mean, that is kind of the definition of the jungle, isn't it?
It feels that way.
They
And I
think
mean,
they're
the
in the
jungle
fucking
obviously is a
jungle.
more dangerous place.
They're using, like, liberals have started using this jungle metaphor as a world of nationalisms, a world of billiard balls, right? It's this, like, it's a kind of like taking the John Mearsheimer view of world politics, like offensive realism. It's tragedy. You cannot trust. Power is the almost, or like, you know, force is the final adjudicator of everything, you know. And so it's this view that, like, security is scarce and it is provided only by force, you know. And there's a lot of bullshit assumptions in that. And it's embracing that crystallized reactionary kind of worldview, which is where liberals are starting to drift, you know. Embracing that allows you to not really have to think too hard about class politics, right? About how the world that you had endorsed and co-signed and advocated and enjoyed and benefited from in the past, how that world caused this world, you know? All right. What do we got in chat? The jungle metaphor is racist. It is exactly, thank you. It's exactly Heart of Darkness shit, you know? And, like, liberals have a side to them. I was a liberal. I still am a liberal in certain ways, you know? I'm not anti-liberal, but like there's a side of liberals that skews progressive, that skews toward socialism, in fact. But there's a side of liberalism that is imperial. And there's a side of liberalism that turns to fascism under the wrong conditions. And it just feels like the elite liberals are really accommodating themselves to a kind of right-wing populist, which is to say fascist. Hashtag not a communist. All right.
Place if you're at the bottom of the food chain. The jungle works out pretty well sometimes if you're at the top. Is Trump getting some of this right from his perspective?
This jungle metaphor.
I guess it's a kind of question of long-term and short-term self-interest, because, you know, I think most of us recognize that having this liberal world order and not trying to gain immediate advantage was probably in our long-term interest. You know, for example, he suggested that we should have hung on to the oil fields, you know, after we liberated Kuwait or Iraq in 2003. that would be something that would be to our short-term advantage. But if you think about the precedent that would set for other big powers that wanted to do something similar, I'm not sure that that would be such a great thing for the U.S. So maybe the real contrast is between short-termism and, investing in a longer-term stable system.
This whole like short-term versus long-termist thinking, there's at a superficial level, this is not a terrible way to think about, Trump is a short-term transactional guy, thinker guy, versus what's in the long-term interest. The weird thing about this, or the problematic thing about this, is that there is no sense that long-term interest is about the root causes of insecurity. Surely, if you take seriously this short-term versus long-term framing, the thing that's actually in the long-term self-interest is addressing the root causes of insecurity, which of course presumes that you're diagnosing them in the first place, which means that you have an account of how we got to here, and they don't. Right. And so once again, it's like this class blind spot, this like world historical blind spot, and this has something to do with doing their analysis. These are not dummies. These are not dumb guys. I keep saying this about people because I think it's true, and we have to acknowledge that. But that doesn't mean that they're correct. They're making really dummy mistakes analytically. They reason from the perspective of a flag. They're looking out at the world from the perspective of a flag, and that means your analysis is fucked. Oh yeah, a drinking game. Well, so I'm in New Zealand, so this is the morning time. I can't drink yet, but I have a feeling they're going to say the word jungle or chaos over under 10 more times, right? So like if you're going to think about what's in your long-term interest, that necessarily means that you're focusing on the root causes, the foundational causes of problems. And there is no sign whatsoever that Fukuyama is doing that. And I should say, as a parenthetical, this is not sour grapes because I didn't get the Stanford job, or it's not entirely sour grapes because I didn't get the Stanford job, but Stanford's a particular kind of place. It's robber baron university, right? It's, as one of the guys in the chat said, like, it's a place that is just awash in billionaire money and like tech sort of right-wing Peter Thiel billionaire type money and finance bros and shit, right? And so those people and that kind of institution are never gonna hire undiplomatic podcast guy. As somebody with class consciousness, I put it in my fucking Twitter bio that I started out as a working class kid instead of being ashamed of my past and trying to hide it with like Kennedy School, whatever. Like I lean into the fact of like where I come from, and that is not done in polite society. And so like somebody like me who speaks out against the capitalist class, who speaks on behalf of workers, who has a kind of class consciousness, that shit that challenges the going concern, that challenges the status quo of the national security state, of the great and the good and the powerful. You think they're going to hire that guy? It's a fucking miracle I got a job interview in the first place there. It's like, that's actually in itself kind of insane. And I wonder why, because like, that don't make no fucking sense. Like, especially because I didn't go to any Ivy League schools, Yeah, I don't fit the culture of the place. But who does fit the culture of the place? A person who doesn't do root cause analysis, a person who has class blind spots and who says things in their writing that justifies power, that justifies the status quo, that justifies the fucking ruling class. Stanford is a point of production for like, ruling class social reproduction. So of course Fukuyama is there. And of course I'm not there, Anyway, let's keep going.
And that's what we seem to be moving away from.
I want you to be right. That feels like the sort of thing that gets you a more stable, long-term international order. I'm wondering if, from the perspective of a country that feels like it's the most powerful and will be the most powerful for a long period of time, and that seems to be Trump's perspective, if he were right about that, would it then be true that America deciding to set the rules the way it...
Chat says, if you're from a working class background, you have to be more Catholic than the Pope to go to an elite institution. And then they welcome you to polish their diversity record. Yeah, like I was, if I would have come into Stanford, I would have been a diversity hire, you know, half Filipino. He's got this story about growing up as a poor kid, you know, he's critical. He's our token critic, token, you know, Democratic Socialist or something like that. Like that would have been the auspices under which they had hired me in the unlikely event that they did. But yeah, I am not more Catholic than the Pope. That's the problem.
wants to would actually have long-term advantages for the Americans, if not for other countries.
God damn you, ads.
Well, yeah, I think that's generally the case. I think that the people that really support international legal orders and rules and so forth are always smaller, weaker countries because they don't have the military, economic, cultural power to look after themselves. The problem, I think, is that we're not as powerful as we were. I mean, I think that, in terms of GDP and this sort of thing, we're still doing okay, but we are politically extremely divided. We don't have a strong bipartisan consensus on what role we want to play as a country in the world.
So, chat made a good point that I had missed earlier. Just a language specificity thing, but like when they talk about chaos, when the Fukuyamians talk about chaos, they do mean like we don't know how to predict it. That's right. Right. They don't mean it in the mathematical sense. That's absolutely true. One thing that's also true about most political scientists is we don't do math, or if we do, it's just statistics, which is pretty basic shit. Yeah. Oh, he just said something that I wanted to catch.
We're still doing okay, but we are politically extremely divided. We don't have a strong bipartisan consensus on what role we want to play as a country in the world.
So this is the other thing, like the Fukuyama liberal types, they really, really bemoan to the extent a lack of bipartisanship. They want, because they're, again, reasoning from the perspective of a flag, they see bipartisanship as this intrinsic public good because it implies if you have bipartisanship, then you have national unity. National unity means that you can more easily mobilize the resources of society the state can mobilize society's resources to do whatever it wants, and it will do it coherently, efficiently, and that makes you a better geopolitical actor on the world stage in this world of the jungle of the billiard balls clashing that they imagine, right? So that's like they love bipartisanship because unity means resource mobilization, and that means efficiency. And liberals love masturbating to efficiency, So I digress. So, but the other thing I wanted to mention there is like, to the extent that the liberals think in terms of root causes about our current moment, the deepest they're kind of ever willing to go is like the Ezra Klein level of polarization, which prevents bipartisanship. Polarization is their root cause. And then like, if you press them on like why this is happening, what's the historical context that gives rise to it? They got nothing. They fall back on like, social media, therefore we should ban TikTok. Like nothing. So fucking ridiculous. Hard pass on the paternalistic language about smaller, weaker nations. Yeah. Are you surprised that this same worldview that fetishized American primacy and is confused about a multipolar world, is it surprising that they would also be paternalistic about smaller powers? You know, all right, I digress.
And therefore we may not be able to, simply use our might to get our way in the way that we were used to, thinking we could.
So, on the one hand, the United States right now is kind of entering this weird period where the U.S. has a more consolidated leadership, and so many of its allies seem to be weaker. Their governments are weaker. They're fragmented. You saw what just happened with Trudeau, South Korea, Germany, France. I could see how that might make Trump feel like actually this is exactly the time to implement that sort of policy. Tell me why you think that's not true.
One of the dangerous things about this present moment is that Trump and the Republicans may be overestimating the degree of unity. He did not win a huge mandate in the November election. Congress is still, the Republican majority in both houses, but especially in the House of Representatives, is very, very narrow.
Yeah.
So they do not have, the kind of mandate that, let's say, Franklin Roosevelt had after 1932, or
It's not clear to me at all why, if like Republicans are MAGA, MAGA is Trumpism, and they control the House of Representatives, the Supreme Court, the Senate, and then in a couple days the fucking presidency. Why would we doubt? And this all is reducible on the right to Trump and Trumpism. And so why would they have trouble pushing through anything they want? It wouldn't be because of Democratic Party resistance. It would only be because of fissures within the Republican coalition. The stuff that I love to see, Bannon versus Elon Musk. That's some Michael Jackson eating popcorn meme shit, but yeah, I don't know.
Lyndon Johnson had after 1964. It's much more tenuous, and the polarization of the country means
Polarization.
that the first misstep that Trump takes is going to probably trigger a lot of internal turmoil.
Well, yeah. So it's not like polarization is a reality, but you don't just, it's not the cause of things. You don't say some such and such because polarization itself has a cause, right? It's downstream of this more inegalitarian world. You've made people eat it so hard for so long, it disillusions them from the status quo, and the only question is the left or the right going to capture that energy? And the right has been way more successful at capturing that energy. Chat says, isn't this bipartisanship also a ship to smuggle politics under the guise of apolitical technocratic consensus? Yes, that is correct. So bipartisanship, in the language of the liberal Washington types, it's like electoral bipartisanship. They can only concede. There is no sense that the masses matter or that civil society matters. People, for all intents and purposes, are not relevant to how they think about power. What they think about is the Congress being able to pass bills and the president being able to sign bills into law and executive orders. Who will stand in the way? How efficiently or smoothly can you do that? You can do that smoothly and easily if you have the two parties colluding together, collaborating together. Thank God they're so similar. And that's all they sort of think about. And so polarization within the political parties presents a huge problem for them, because it means that bipartisanship breaks down. But yeah, it's bipartisanship does not equal national consensus. It doesn't even consider larger civil society or the masses, yeah, the mandate. Yeah, who cares? This, everything you hear these guys saying, they're they're people out of time. Like they're out of step with the world as it has evolved. And the world has evolved in this way partly because of these fucks, you know.
So we may not be as strong, but the danger is that Trump will think we're strong, and he will try something. I don't know, invading Panama or Greenland that he actually thinks will be easy, but will turn into quagmires.
I think he can beat the Danes. I'm less worried about that one. But I take your point. No, but I take your point.
Even Denmark, if he actually does this without the consent of Denmark or the people in Greenland, that's going to set a pretty difficult precedent, for other countries to start following. So again, it's this long-term.
I don't know that Fukuyama has said anything about Gaza. My guess is, since he's at Stanford, that he has not. But another like stock concern of guys like this is the idea of like precedent. They're thinking about the norms and the soft power shit that supported American hegemony, because American hegemony required more than pure direct domination. It required the ornaments on the Christmas tree. It required institutions and norms that structured things in a way where like smaller powers would act according to their own interest. And it just so happened that in them doing so, it benefited the US, like that's hegemony. And so norms are important in that way. Like you layer them on top of the foundation of primacy. And so the idea of precedent in a world of norms matters a lot. Track record matters a lot. What does this open up? How do things shift or not? So like he's very concerned about precedent, which is laughable given that like I said earlier, Gaza has blown a hole in our moral universe. Everybody's fucking cynical now. Everybody's got a fucking super jaundiced view of things who works in foreign policy. Like you almost have to not deal with facts to exist in that world now. And you're worried about precedent. All right.
Vision that seems to be lacking right now in this incoming administration.
I'm wondering, if you were Trump, if you were trying to implement the policy that he is stating. Listen to this.
Son of a bitch. Although that was a dope.
And knowing where China is right now, economically not doing as well, but absolutely over the past decades, catching up on the US, investing a massive amounts in nuclear capabilities. If you were Trump, is the right thing to
no
do
more Ozempic if Greenland
to hit China as hard as possible now when they're comparatively weak and before they can pose as much of a threat to the US?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by hit them. If you mean
sorry, I missed that because I was
abilities. If you were Trump, is the right thing to do to hit China as hard as possible now when they're comparatively weak and before they can pose as much of a threat to the US?
Well,
what kind of fucking question is that? Are you fucking kidding me? That's World War III, dude. He just... What kind of question is that? Do you hit, if you're Trump, do you hit China now as hard as you can while they're comparatively weak? That's IR theory brain. You know what he's talking about? That's Robert Gilpin hegemonic stability theory, which is one way of understanding why wars happen. So like in IR theory brain, and where you think that the only thing that exists in the world that matters is like other great powers, wars happen when a hegemon is declining and there's a rising power at the same time. And with that rise and decline, war happens either because the rising power is dissatisfied with the existing order and so challenges the declining hegemon when they think they're strong enough, or war happens because the declining hegemon decides to strike the rising power while they're at their strongest because they're a declining power. So strike them now while you've still got some lead in your pencil. And then, so those are the two directions that from which war will come in IR theory brain. But that's bullshit. That's talking about World War III, dude. Why would you just assume that that's what's supposed to happen? Only because of IR theory brain rot.
I guess it depends on what you mean by hit them. If you mean,
What do you mean?
raise tariffs and wage economic warfare, I'm assuming that he's going to do some version of that. I think that, he'll find in that realm that he actually doesn't have the kind of clout, and that China has been preparing responses that he may not be anticipating. So it may not be so easy for him to get away with, trying to exploit this moment, as you say. The much more worrisome thing is in the strategic realm, because I have no confidence that he knows what he's doing in that respect. I don't think that he takes overt military threats all that seriously. I don't think he spent much of his life thinking about defense policy or military preparedness. I think he's tried to run away from
clearly
conflicts,
true.
and I don't think he was very willing to use American force in his first term. I think that's really a danger, because all of those factors that you talked about, instability in South Korea, uncertainty with NATO allies, I think, might actually tempt China or Russia to take advantage of the situation. And there, I'm not sure what the response is going to be.
Do you?
Just catching up on chat. Have you ever played the game Diplomacy? I have not, but I've heard, I have a bunch of former students who have said I would A, love it, B, I should fold it into my course on wargaming, C, that I should play it. And so a short answer is no, but I've been told before that I should be. Buff Angelist, we need a policy wonk bingo card. You know what? That's true. We do need some kind of these kind of reaction videos. It's kind of fun to process this shit in real time, especially when it's somebody you disagree with. And it would be more fun if there was a keyword kind of bingo card. Yeah. Because they do lean, one of the realities of the policy wonk is that they lean heavily on a particular jargon lexicon. There's a language to being a national security bro or to being a lib, so that would be very useful in the future. Yes. All right. Let me keep going here.
You think right now we are heading towards a new Cold War, but this time between the Americans and the Chinese?
What do you mean heading toward?
Are we going to continue?
Wait, that's the fucking, are you fucking shitting me? What do you think this book is, dog? Are you fucking kidding me? The Rivalry Peril. It's been a matter of official policy that we're in an existential rivalry with a great power enemy. They said Cold War. That fucking House jerk-off China Hawk committee that Mike Gallagher set up, their actual mission statement was to win the new Cold War. How is it even a fucking question?
Decoupling, so that it's not simply in these areas like semiconductors and strategic materials, but across the board, so that our farmers are no longer so dependent on Chinese markets. We're not so dependent on TVs and consumer goods and that sort of thing. And that would make the situation much more similar to the economic relationship we had with the former Soviet Union. And I think that we probably are heading for something like that, because I would be very surprised if Trump simply stayed with the kind of Biden-level decoupling, that was limited to these particular strategic sectors, because I think he's much more ambitious about that and thinks that China's, a much bigger.
So I should say, I've been on the record about this, but the logic of great power competition, the logic, which is a hollow phrase, it's a mask for primacy. The logic of a primacy strategy is decoupling, right? If you're thinking in nationalist terms, flag versus flag, primacy under conditions that do not allow it. So you're trying to use the power of the state to grab a greater share of a shrinking economic pie. That is the world that is the great power competition world. And in that world, the state is this instrument of fucking power that the Biden administration is using. Nationalism is the ideology that justifies their power consolidation. Power consolidation benefits, quote unquote, the nation, actually benefits the ruling class of the nation and the national security state. So, like, there's a lot of national security state self-aggrandizement going on, including in China, by the way. So I forget why I was ranting about that already.
Economic threat, and the Chinese, have a lot of ways of responding to that.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, decoupling. So the Biden administration's, the logic of its China policy, the logic of primacy strategy has pushed the Biden administration toward economic decoupling. It has taken the form of techno containment, economic containment, right? It has taken the form of, like, Jake Sullivan would call it small yard, high fence. So you're ring fencing the certain high technology, high profit for the future sectors of the economy. It's not a full decoupling, but the logic of all of this is full decoupling, because you're trying to create more permissive space to make war between the two powers feasible. One of the things that national security strategists struggle with in our current moment is that the great powers are economically interdependent, which means you cannot realistically imagine taking the fight to them and attacking them and going to war and shit, because it's like a self-own. And only through decoupling do you create the world, the jungle, that allows you to imagine fighting and winning against the adversary. Can you actually fight and win against the adversary? Not in a meaningful way. But if you break the back of economic interdependence, which means decoupling, then you can do that. And the Biden administration's national security bros have been all about that. That's like overtly part of what they're trying to do. That's part of what Bidenomics is what has been trying to do. And that will, of course, I think, continue under Trump, although Elon Musk is like the countervailing force because he has business interests in China. So decoupling is the logic of the train that we are on. It's only a question of how far, how fast, right? And so I guess I would agree with Fukuyama about this.
If that happens, what do you think happens to other countries? Do you think the Europeans will end up becoming essentially a bloc with the US against China, or as they did with the Soviets, or much less so? Do you think that there will be the Gulf states, for example, ditto, much less so? I mean, how do you think, because a Cold War, of course, is not just about the relations between the two superpowers, but also about the broader geopolitical landscape?
Well, I think that the Europeans, up until the last 3 years, had illusions that they could be vaguely on the side of the United States, when it came to human rights and democracy, but they could still trade with China. I mean, the critical country here is Germany, who has such large investments in China and also depends on the Chinese market to sell their automobiles to such an extent that they were trying to hold on to that economic relationship. I think they've given up on that. And I think that means that they will increasingly realize that they have to be pulled into a, North American economic bloc. The thing
So one of the things that I think is happening with Europe is that Europe is economically depressed. Like, their growth prospects are absolute shit, and at best they are in the shadow of the US. So, like, apologies if any of you are from Europe. But what this means, like, that's where I think the rise in nationalism in Europe is coming from too. So the rise of far right parties and shit. Like I said earlier, the rise of nationalist politics is a response to the conditions brought about, the shitty conditions brought about by neoliberal economic order. which is ironic and fresh because that was the creation of the West, of the Europe and the United States. But so like we've given birth to these nationalisms, and these nationalisms are the only pathway for European states to have some prospect of economic growth going into this future of globally depressed growth, secular stagnation in the economist language, right? So in a world of secular stagnation, again, the shrinking economic pie, it's powerful states with the resources to grab that will be able to power their economies. And that is a kind of might makes right, but it's like a materialist class conscious might makes right, and so like I think the European project, what I'm afraid of is that European elites are going to increasingly, in a context of nationalist politics, they're going to look to Uncle Sugar and to the US to try and create a kind of Western civilization bloc, like a kind of 21st century empire that they can benefit from, that will be state directed heavily, that will be powered by versions of ethno-nationalism. And that's going to further empower the reactionary right in all of these countries. But it's going to, on some level, it's going to be driven by economic interest, like the need structurally, the pressures to try and carve out a pathway of growth in a very unpromising world. And that is ironically going to be the source of like so much danger. And it's going to, of course, throw off infinite amounts of violence onto, we should start calling it the third world again, the global South, what do we got in the chat? Yeah. So the austerity policies are part of the neoliberal, yes, rise of nationalist parties in Europe come from austerity policies. The austerity policies are part of the neoliberal economic order. The neoliberal economic order has been producing less economic growth. That's one of the secular trends, right? Which is part of why it's like not sustainable. Secular stagnation in a neoliberal economic order. That's been our reality. And so if this win-win globalization world isn't paying dividends like it used to, then the promise of it and the promise of that technocratic politics is totally unsustainable. That's when you start looking for alternatives. The key alternative is the nationalist politics. So yeah. So that's not disagreeing. That's like, there's a way to fold those together, I think. Global majority, I've started using global majority because instead of global, I use global South because I don't want to, you use the language that people understand. You know what I mean? If everybody was using third world, I would say third world. But the global South by population is the global majority. So yeah, like I don't have a problem with that. I think in my Twitter bio, I say like world making for the global majority, I think that's a good way to phrase it.
I think that the Russia invasion of Ukraine demonstrated, however, is that there are all these new alignments, and there's a very large part of the global South, most important India, that isn't going to be in the American camp.
India is the only global South country that liberals care about. You heard it here first. India is the only global South country that liberals care about.
Against China, but they also don't want to give up on any of their economic ties with that whole bloc. And so I do think that in that respect, there is going to be this, Cold War-like realignment.
And China is, of course, India's most important trade partner. I want to ask you about Russia next. How are you thinking about the threat that Russia today and its allies pose to the global order, and how should America respond to it?
Well,
so when he says Russia's allies, he's talking about like this, axis of resistance type shit. So like the neocon imaginary conceives, even before it was a thing, it conceived of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran as being like a package deal. But like, I guarantee you, we're about to hear Fukuyama respond to this question about Russia and its allies. I guarantee you he's not going to put forward any explanation for how this axis of baddies came together, because they came together in response to American primacy and the fact that we sanctioned the whole fucking world. We sanctioned all of them. We pushed all of them together. America brought its rivals together. This is an indisputable fact. It's the cause of the thing that we don't like, which is the unity of our rivals. And I guarantee you that what Fukuyama is about to say is not going to acknowledge that. Let's see.
I think the critical phrase you added was "and its allies," because the thing, I think that Russia right now is actually quite weak. And we could be surprised by Putin, falling. I think the way, we've been surprised with other dictatorships. But I think what's really new and very troubling is that there's a genuine alliance. I mean, back in the days when
Chat says, nice how they allied China being one of India's biggest enemies. Yeah, fancy that. It's literally not a coincidence. Like in the Pentagon thinking, going back to as early as 2002, way before China was actually any kind of threat to the US, the Pentagon strategists saw India as a quote unquote natural counterweight to China. And they have been fetishizing that shit ever since.
we were talking about the axis of evil at the time of the Iraq invasion, that was a very loose, kind of paranoid phrase because, Iran and North Korea had nothing really to do with one another. But today it's a real alliance where they're actively collaborating. They're selling each other weapons.
Explain, motherfucker. I shouldn't say motherfucker. Explain, sir.
Troops from one country to another. China has not been fully involved because it does want to protect its trade relations with other democracies, but I think they're doing everything they can quietly to support the Russian war effort, and that may be, that may become more visible over time.
So, Frank, I want to take a step back because everything that you and I are discussing so far, not really the direction we would want the world to be heading. Where did we get it wrong? I don't mean you and me, but I mean, leaders and the dynamics we've had in this evolving post-Cold War environment.
Let's not talk about what me and you have gotten wrong, but maybe others.
How did we end up on this trajectory?
Well, if I could refer to the last book I wrote on liberalism, I think that there I pointed to two what I believe are distortions of liberalism that had but then produced a big backlash. So the first one is, what we call neoliberalism. It was this period of, a kind of uncritical worship of markets that really destabilized things. I mean, we didn't have financial crises up until the early 1990s because, we had a lot of constraints on the way that banks and financial flows moved through the world. But all of a sudden, we got, periodic really big crises and rising inequality, the deindustrialization of the American heartland.
He's saying all this stuff about financialization and deindustrialization and financial crises and bubbles, crises of capital accumulation, without any kind of attempt to actually make sense of it. This is like, I cannot take this whole like analysis in a vacuum shit. Like the historical blind spottedness here, the unwillingness to try and offer historical accounts that make sense of our current moment makes it impossible to actually be productive in the world or to like advise responsibly about what to do in the world, This conversation is both appalling and hilarious, the chat says. I have to agree. This is my favorite kind of conversation, by the way, where like you get people who are smart guys and that are also saying dummy stuff, and then you sort of pull it apart, and like there's a lot that's revealing. Occasionally we agree, but mostly it's like, this is fucking so stupid, man. Yeah. All right.
We thought, Americans were going to tolerate that up until the middle of the next decade, when it turned out that that was fueling a big, domestic backlash. So that was one part of it. And then I think, the left has gone off in a different.
Oh, you're going to talk about the left now. Let's fucking hear this. Let's hear this. I can't wait.
Direction culturally where
his book on identity politics, which prefaces whatever he's about to say here. It was literally about this reductionist view of the left. Well, not only about that, but it was about this reductionist view of the left that focused only on what he had even embraced as wokeness. So like basically identity politics in social justice form, but totally stripping out the economic justice reality of what leftism like is, like there is no class component to how he understands the left. And that is as tragic as it is fucking laughable and wrong.
Has bought into a form of identity politics that,
oh yeah, I told you,
in the end, can be just as polarized. I think that liberals today underestimate the degree to which some of the identity-based politics that was practiced, by Democrats was one of the reasons that people ended up, a lot of these working class people ended up voting for Donald Trump. And so I think both of these.
So there's a superficial way, and that might be true, Nancy Pelosi in kente cloth and like the various like symbolic gestures that Democratic Party leadership makes to like diversity and equality, representational equality. The right certainly chafes at that and reacts to that. It's not like first of all, that's not the cause of anything specifically, but more importantly, that is a malfunction of the Democratic Party to try and co-opt social justice. Social justice, where I come from, has always meant material redress. Martin Luther King was not just a civil rights activist. He was an economic democracy activist. The material redress, economic democracy, working class power, that's always been part of the left's agenda. But the liberal mind mutates that shit in how they interpret it and focuses only on this symbolic aspect. And so like it's correct to criticize the Democratic Party for doing quote unquote woke politics, but Fukuyama's subtle answer to what ought to be done because of that is to be less woke. Because again, he's not thinking in terms of class analysis. And so, or in material terms. And so he's only thinking like, well, if woke politics makes the right chafe, then maybe we get rid of the woke politics. Instead of, how about you don't hive off woke politics from the economic demands that would follow if you took woke politics seriously, if you took economic democracy seriously, which is another way of saying if you took democracy seriously. He has such a thin sense of what democracy is. He thinks it's like you punch a ticket at an election booth and that's democracy. That's not democracy. That's just one of the trappings of how we institutionalize it. If you only do that, you ain't got no democracy. All right, sorry.
Contributed to the deterioration of the common belief in the legitimacy of liberal principles, and the authority of established sources of credible information have really deteriorated. So you put all that together, and I think you get the kind of world we're entering into right now.
How much of a representative democracy is the United States today?
I guess that not I'm not that worried about the future of democracy. I think that what the real threat is the erosion of the liberal part of liberal democracy. So the liberal part really is the rule of law, constitutional checks and balances, all these constraints on executive power. And I think that that's what Trump is going to threaten in the first instance. Appointing Kash Patel to run the FBI is not a vote in favor of a neutral enforcement of a impartial rule of law. But I do
True
think that
enough.
there are probably limits to how far he can push that, and I suspect there will be some backlash if he really tries to misuse that power. The democracy part, I think, is not nearly as threatened as the liberal part, because the Republicans just won, pretty decisively the last election. But
Not sure how that's a adequate measure of democracy, but sure. By the way, if anyone has suggestions for who to raid after this, let me know in the chat. We got a little bit more to go here, but I want to. I keep shitting the bed on rating channels. So I'd like to not shit the bed this time.
once you start eroding the liberal respect for law and rules, you will start eroding democracy eventually. That's what's happened in Hungary and a lot of these other
Oligarchy
authoritarian places.
Liberal.
The one other thing that I have been particularly concerned about is that, in addition to those two misinterpretations of liberalism, there's a third one, which really has to do with what I would call excessive proceduralism. You can't build anything in the United States right now because
what he's coding as excessive proceduralism. This is, again, why is he at Stanford? This is coded language for like what Fareed Zakaria also co-signed a couple weeks ago. The Doge Boys, Department of Government Efficiency. It's the red tape. The real the problems in this world is woke politics, red tape, bureaucracy, and polarization. These are like the trio of evils in the liberal imagination. It's fucking he's not worried. I'm sure he'll still be able to have his office in John Steinbeck's dorm and make immense amounts of money for the rest of his life in a great weather climate. Anyways, I'm not jealous.
There are way too many rules. And this is something that Nick Bagley at Michigan has written about, that liberals want to use government for their own social justice and other purposes, but they believe that legitimacy springs from procedures. And I think that what's happened is that we've lost sight of the need of governments to actually deliver concrete results. And that's particularly a bad problem in my state of California, where it's really, really hard to even build things that liberals want, like transmission lines and solar farms and offshore wind. And I think that part of the impulse towards more authoritarian government is that people are just fed up with, all the rule of law constraints on doing stuff. I mean, the one really worrisome country right now is El Salvador, where you had a really impossibly high murder rate. And then, Nayib Bukele gets elected. He basically jails most of the young male population of El Salvador, and then the crime rate drops by 90%.
He's the most popular democratically elected leader in the world today.
Yeah. I think we think about this wrong. It's not like some of these leaders wake up in the morning.
Wow. Okay. So they think the solution is a bigger security state. Throw the baddies in jail. Just if you jailed more people, maybe there would be fewer problems. That sounds very liberal. Yeah, sure.
And say, well, I'm an authoritarian. That's my framework, and I'm going to be an authoritarian when I come to power. They think, I want to do something. And here are all these judges and courts and bureaucrats that are standing in my way, and I can't get done what the people elected me to do. And that's what leads to this authoritarian impulse to go around the rule of law. And I think that's one of the big challenges that liberal democracies are facing today.
Frank Fukuyama, wonderful to see you again at G0 World.
Wonderful to see you all. Yes. All right. Well, that was fun and as stupid. Didn't you know jails don't have problems? Touche. Yes. All right. This was super fun. I got to like half of what I needed to get to today on the agenda. So there's a very strong chance that I'm going to try to book in again tomorrow for another live stream. In the meantime, I'm going to throw y'all to the Surfs TV. Hopefully this works. Let's see here. Yeah, buddy, here we go. This was fun, guys. Hopefully I'll catch you tomorrow. 3, 2, 1, and here we go.